Tony, would you like to start the brag?
Yes, sir.
Business part of the meeting?
Yes, sir. First off, I'd like to welcome everyone to the December 9th, 2020 Zoom brag meeting. First time. Hopefully we'll do this several more times before we can all get together in person and continue those meetings in Dahlonega. So, Manny, is there a treasurer's report you would like to present, sir?
Thank you, Tony. Welcome, everybody. We're all guinea pigs in this together. This is going to be quick and short. I'm going to share my screen for just a second.
I'll stop sharing so you can share your.
Here we go. So here we go. Everybody gets to see the bank statement. So we've had no activity since last time I reported. It's been $691.25 ever since, and we have gained nothing because we get no credits or no debits, and that's it. We have made, the board has made a decision on dues, which I will talk about next month. So that's it for the treasurer's report, unless anybody has any questions. All yours, Tony.
All right. Dr. Nguyen, would you like to make any announcements concerning any possible future guest speakers for brag?
I certainly would. When we had our board meeting the other night, we suddenly realized that we're no longer limited to how far a guest speaker is willing to drive to Dahlonega to speak to us. And so the result is we got kind of greedy and started talking about having people calling in from South Africa and the Western Pacific and stuff like that. But we will limit ourselves a little bit if we try real hard. But we do have a glowing list of potential audiences. We have a glowing list of potential speakers, and we will begin with these new speakers next month. We'll give you an email notice as to who's going to speak and when and so on sometime in the next few weeks. Welcome to everybody. We're just really glad to have all the folks who've logged in. I'm hoping that Bill or somebody has a way of finding out how many people logged on tonight. But we're very happy to have all the connections. We had not expected to have this wide a spread, but it's great to have you all here. And thank you for logging on. Bill?
Thank you, Jag.
Tony?
I'd also like to thank everyone for being here, brag members, GAS members, other guests who have logged on to the lecture. We appreciate that. At this time, I'm going to turn it on over back to Bill Balco so that he may introduce our guest speaker. Bill?
Thanks, Tony. Nicola, would you like to go ahead and share your screen? Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Here we go.
All right.
Now, can you, oh, there we go.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming, especially because we have so many guests from the Greater Atlanta Archaeological Society joining us, and some students, some other faculty from Georgia State. Calling you out, Jeff. We got to chat sometime. It's really my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Nicola Sharrat. Dr. Sharrat grew up around Canterbury, England, and attended Cambridge for her undergrad. After deciding that law was not the right path, she made the absolutely astounding and correct decision to pursue archaeology. She pursued a master's and then completed her PhD as well at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I'm very familiar with the area because I grew up just down the road from it, and Nick and I ran into each other at conferences when we were both grad students. We've known each other since 2010 in a professional capacity. She completed her dissertation titled Social Identities of State Collapse, a diachronic, sorry, I had to write this very quickly, a diachronic study of Tiwanaku burials in the Moquegua Valley, Peru. She has published in numerous prestigious journals, including Geoarchaeology, the Journal of Field Archaeology, American Anthropologist, Advances in Archaeological Practice, and Latin American Antiquity. I would like you to join me in welcoming Dr. Nicola Sharrat for this meeting sponsored by Bragg. Go ahead, Nick. It's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. It's really nice to see like familiar faces from Chicago down here. So I'm really happy Bill and I both ended up down in the Atlanta area. And thank you also to, let me see if I can get this right. There we go. I wanted to actually say thanks to Jack, to Manny, to Tony, also to GAS for having me. I've spoken to both of these groups over the last few years, mostly about my excavation project in southern Peru, which is where we've been looking at kind of questions of how people lived through and dealt with the collapse of one of the earliest states in South America. And the GSU team has absolutely been continuing that work. And I especially wanted to thank the GAS folks here and let you know that that gorgeous turquoise t-shirt you gave me a few years ago has become one of my most favorite things to wear in the field. So I'm very grateful for the t-shirt as well as for the repeat invite. Today we're going to mostly stay in Andean South America. But this talk is actually a little bit different from the talks that I've given you guys before. And I want to chat with you about something that's really been more of a side project for me. It's really kind of a detour from thinking about these questions of turbulence and political strife, whether in the past or in the present. So I do promise that there is archaeology in this talk. We'll look at quite a lot of archaeological artifacts, mostly from museum collections. But we're also going to draw on some ethnography, including interviews that I've done with weavers and with ritual specialists. We'll look at some historical sources. And as I promised in the title, we'll also look at some controversy. And that controversy really is around some recent debates about illegal substances. As we will do this, we will make a brief foray out of the Andes and we'll swing by Atlanta en route during this talk. So what we're really going to focus on today is a particular kind of object, a particular kind of textile. And that's something called a chuspa. And you can see the gentleman in the image on the left holding one of these chuspas. That's from a series of really famous photographs that a Peruvian photographer called Martin Chambi took in the first half of the 20th century. They're really wonderful photographs of Peru at that point. And then you can see one of these objects on the left. That's an object from natural history in New York. And of course, as I'm sure all of you know, the Andes is very famous for its textiles, especially its archaeological textiles. And that's in part, of course, due to the incredible preservation that Andean archaeologists get to work with as a result of that really arid kind of coastal strip that runs along the west and the Pacific coast of South America. And with really good reasons, textiles from this area have been lauded as just exquisite pieces of art. They're characterized by incredible technological sophistication, by immensely elaborate iconographic details, and by the adoption of really interesting kind of techniques around textile production, things like embroidery. All of these pieces that you're seeing on here from the Met date between about 100 BC and AD 1000, right? So these are all archaeological pieces. That's what I'm talking about when I say that the preservation of textiles from this part of the world is almost unprecedented. So they're beautiful pieces of art, right? I'm not going to question that. But textiles in this part of the world are much more than just pretty objects. There is lots and lots of evidence that textiles, both in the past and also in the more recent Andean present, are really important to things like social life and economic systems and political organization and ritual practice. So for instance, we know that the Incas used textiles as a form of taxation, as a form of tribute. We know that they also used them as gifts to reward kind of political loyalists, for instance. Textiles both in the past and in the present in the Andes are really important markers of an individual's ethnicity or gender identity or social status or age. And what I'm going to try and suggest today is that this particular kind of textile that we're going to look at, these chuspas, right, these Coca bags that we're going to look at, are especially emblematic of the ways that textiles serve really interesting kind of social functions in South America. And that's specifically because of what these bags contain, right? What they hold, right? They're not just any old bag. It's not just any old purse. It's a bag that specifically holds what are called coca leaves, right? These pretty unassuming leaves, right? That you see on the images on the right. So I'll be talking both about textiles, but I'll also be talking about coca and coca leaves. And just to give you a sense of kind of how this project came about, because again, those of you who've heard me speak before have heard me talk specifically about my excavation project and as a field archaeologist. And this was a little sort of detour in my career a few years ago, just before I started working at Georgia State. And it was a project that began as an idea for an exhibition that eventually went on display in 2014 in New York. And so that's kind of the basis of this. So again, a little detour from my archaeology, my regular archaeology, and all the work I'm going to be talking about was done under the auspices of this project that American Museum of Natural History and then an institution called the Bard Graduate Center had asked me to put together. So I'm drawing a lot really on work that I did for them, and then also some earlier projects that I did for the Field Museum and Natural History. So kind of the way that I've sort of organized this, because we're talking about sort of lots of different things and lots of different time periods and kind of moving around the Andes. We'll look first at kind of these bags as textiles, right? Because we're going to look at about 2,000 years of textiles through these bags and think about them really as these interesting objects whose kind of technique and imagery changes through time. But then what I want to do is really think about why they're so important, right? Why they have been around for 2,000 years, why people have continued to make the same kind of object for millennia. And as I said, I think that's about what they contain, right? That's about their purpose. So then we're going to look at this story of coca. And that's going to get us into some of this controversy that I've mentioned in the title when we look at some of the more recent history around the coca leaf. So let's start kind of thinking about Andean textile traditions. Andean textile traditions actually go back a really, really long way. As I've already mentioned, the Andes is known for its incredible archaeological textiles because of this preservation. And it seems that the origins of textile production in this part of the world go back as much as 12,000 years ago. And that's evidence that comes from this site right up in the north of Peru called Guerrero Cave. And that's where we have the very earliest directly radiocarbon dated textiles. And they're basically kind of little mats or carpets that were made of a plant fiber that had essentially been beaten down into little strands, and then those were interlaced to kind of look like a little mat, right? At this point, people aren't wearing these textiles, but they're probably using them as sort of blankets or floor coverings. It's about 5,000 years ago when we first start to see things that we might recognize as cloth. And again, this, the fact that we have this evidence owes entirely to the incredible preservation on the coast of Peru. So about 5,000 years ago is when we first see things that look more like actual cloth, right? And these have been excavated in the mid-20th century by Junius Bird, who was an expert in South American textiles at Natural History. And over time, what happens is textile production gets increasingly complex in the region. We begin to see the adoption of looms, right, a weaving technology about 3,500 years ago. And then about 2,100 years ago, the beginnings of some of the techniques that we would recognize in textiles today, right? Things like embroidery and tie-dye. And through this period, of course, sort of different iconographic repertoires. But thinking about these bags specifically, right, that kind of purse form that I showed you earlier, the earliest examples of those that I've been able to find are about 2,000, maybe just slightly over 2,000 years old. There is some reference to maybe earlier bags in some earlier contexts, but these are the earliest examples of these coca bags that we've been able to identify. And these come from the south coast of Peru, from the Nazca culture, which if you're familiar with the Nazca lines, that's what we're thinking about. And which you see some similar imagery on some of the bags that we see in those Nazca lines. We probably have these so early preserved because, again, this particular part of the coast, even in overall arid desert environment, this particular part of the Pacific coast is really arid. If we go a little bit later on the north coast of Peru, between about 81 and 700, we still see these bags showing up. The soil's a bit more acidic in this part of the coast, and so things don't preserve quite as well. But this is a coca bag that the Metropolitan Museum of Art has identified in their collections, which again has a lot of imagery that we would see on moche art elsewhere. The other thing that we start to see with the moche, so slightly later than our Nazca collections, is depictions of these bags. So I'm not sure, I'm hoping you can see, yeah, you can see hopefully my little arrow there. These two vessels are what we call stirrup spout vessels. If you look here at this warrior, and we know he's a warrior because he's got this particular headdress on and he's got a little mace here. And he's got one of these bags hanging off his belt here. This little man here, and there's repeated depictions of individuals sat like this, these kind of molded vessels. And he's got one of these chuspas, one of these coca bags, slung over the back of his shoulder. And they continue to show up throughout the pre-Hispanic record, both as the physical objects, the bags, but also these depictions of them. And by the time we get to the Inca Empire in the late pre-Hispanic period, so we're talking the sort of 13th through early 16th centuries, we see fairly consistent production of the same bag. So this hexagonal image that you're seeing here, this hexagonal motif, becomes very common across the entire scope of the Inca Empire, which, as you know, covers a huge territory in South America. But what we also start to see in the Inca Empire, right, this state that is characterized by significant social stratification, by the emergence of a really strong and powerful monarchy, is particular kinds of bags restricted to particular kinds of groups of individuals. So the image on the left shows you what's called a pendant bag. There is a scholar who specifically studied these pendant coca bags, and they do seem to be restricted specifically to royalty. The kind of red sort of dangly tassels off them mimic a tassel that the Inca emperor wore on his headdress. Very occasionally we get these feathered bags that you see on the right. That one from the Met is actually still stuffed with coca leaves. We have a number of these bags that still have the coca leaves in them. Because a fair question I always get is, how do we know these are coca bags and not something else? And one of the ways we often know they're coca bags is they literally have coca leaves in them. And I'll show you some more of those. The other nice thing about the Inca Empire is we start to have other kinds of evidence to think about these bags, right? And much of that evidence comes from early colonial chronicles, early colonial historians' kind of accounts of the Inca Empire. And these, I hope some of you have seen images of these before. Guaman Poma de Ayala was an individual who was born to a Spanish father and an Andean mother. And in 1615, he wrote a long letter to the Spanish king, basically trying to advocate, for the most part, for Andean populations. And he did that by trying to write this detailed letter telling the Spanish king about Inca ways of life. And he illustrates the letter with these hundreds and hundreds of really detailed drawings. What I really like about these detailed drawings is if you're looking for them, these coca bags start showing up all over the place, right? So the image on the left is the Inca emperor, and according to the kind of text over it, he is singing to his red llama. Apparently that's what he liked to do, was to sing to his special llama. And he's holding his little coca bag there, slung over his arm. The gentleman on the right is the captain in the Inca army, and he's clearly having a nap, but he's hung, if you look above his bed, he's hung his little coca bag there while he has his nap. We also see them in Guaman Poma's drawings. We see these chuspas. Ooh. We see these chuspas showing up also in various kinds of ritual contexts. We'll come back to the actual use of the coca leaves in a little bit. But if you see the image on the left, it's a sorcerer pulling coca leaves out in order to kind of divine for his customer. And somebody bringing coca leaves in their little chuspa as they visit a dead relative. All of these pre-Hispanic examples of these bags, of these coca bags, would have been woven from natural fibers, either from alpaca fibers, occasionally from vicuña fibers, and they all would have been spun, the fibers by hand, and then woven on a loom. But of course, the Spanish, with their conquest in 1533, introduced new technologies and materials to craft production. And what we see in the 16th and the 17th century is this process of kind of intercultural contact and interchange around production. So this is one of my favorite chuspa bags, because it's absolutely an amalgamation of Andean practices around craft production and Spanish influence. And you can see that both in the kind of the weave and the colors and the iconography, the kind of imagery, the kind of motifs that are on this bag, which are very Incan. But then the little flap on it always reminds me of like a clutch purse. Like I own a bunch of purses that kind of have this form to them. And that's a very European style, right? That's first brought in with Spanish conquest and during the early colonial period. So you begin to see this kind of hybridization in these chuspas, right? That speak to these kind of social transformations that happen in the Andes through this 2,000-year period. And that continues to happen as we move into the 18th and the 19th century, as we see these bags begin to be made out of a wider range of materials, right? So we get knitted bags in the 19th century, and we get these little leather bags showing up. Yet these traditional forms continue also to be made throughout the 20th century. These are all ethnographic examples that were made around about the middle of the 20th century, the sort of first half to the middle of the 20th century. These are all parts of ethnographic collections in New York City. And the particularities of the designs, as with other textiles in this part of the world, very much speak to kind of regional traditions, right? That they're markers of particular community or regional or ethnic identities. And then these continue to be made today, right? So these are Chuspas, these are Coca bags that were made within the last 10 or 15 years. And they were made by weavers in southern Peru, in the part of Peru where I do my archaeology, where weavers still very much weave for a local market. They weave for their own families, and they weave for other families in their communities. And so these bags are still produced, but they're increasingly, of course, produced by things like synthetic dyes and synthetic fibers, right? So that's just like a brief summary of how these bags kind of look over 2,000 years, right? And I think, to me, they're really striking for their longevity, right? Of course, as with other textiles, there are differences in the particularities of their designs and particularities of the technologies, the manufacturing kind of approaches that are being used. But what is interesting is that they endure in a way that other kinds of craft objects don't, right? Other kinds of elements of what people are wearing change significantly through this 2,000 years. So the question then becomes for me, why do these products, why does this one bag keep getting made for 2,000 years? And as I said at the beginning, I really think that the answer lies in what they contain, okay? So what I want to do now is kind of move to the second part of this talk and think more specifically about that product that these bags have for 2,000 years being created to hold. Because I think what it asks us to do is to think a bit more anthropologically, right? And to stop just thinking about these bags in terms of what they look like and how they were made, to think more about how they were used, right? To think about them not just as these beautiful pieces of art, right? And I don't disagree with an art historian who would say that these are just beautiful pieces of work, but I think that they're really interesting in other kinds of ways. So what I want to do now is just talk a little bit about the coca leaf, okay? It's a very unassuming leaf, right? It looks kind of like a bay leaf. I should really have a scale bar in here, right? But it's not much bigger than a bay leaf either, right? It's a very unassuming leaf, yet it makes these bags, right? It makes these textiles really, really significant and really, really important for people for 2,000 years. So just a little bit about the coca leaf, if you're not familiar with this plant. Not only does the leaf look pretty unassuming, but the bush itself looks pretty unassuming, right? It's a fairly small bush or a tree. It's native to Andean South America. It does now grow elsewhere. It's been imported around the world now. And it grows in specific environmental zones in Andean South America. There's at least 200 species of the coca plant out there. Of which there's about 4 variants that are domesticates now, right? So there's about 4 variants that are actively grown and cultivated and consumed by humans. And that process seems to have begun about 7,000 years ago. And it began for a good reason, right? Because again, if we think about the environment of Andean South America, it encompasses incredible environmental and climatic diversity and very, very challenging environments, right? Really difficult environments for people to make a living in, especially environments that are characterized by really high altitude mountain ranges. Again, if you've ever been up at high altitude, you know how difficult it is to do anything physical at high altitude environments. And the coca leaf is really, really useful in this kind of high altitude environment, right? So it's in this particular dramatic environmental context that we have to think about why the coca leaf becomes important, and by extension, why those coca bags, those chuspas, become important, right? And that's because when you chew the leaves, and if you look really closely at this gentleman here, you can see there's a little kind of bulge in the side of his cheek. And that's because he's got a small wad of coca leaves that he's chewing on, right? And when you do that, they essentially act as a mild stimulant. Some of you may well have chewed coca leaves. I certainly have on numerous occasions. And the best way, I think, to describe the effect is it's kind of like if you were to take an aspirin and to drink a cup of coffee at the same time, right? It just sort of perks you up a little bit, right? It makes you feel like you've got a bit more energy, your headache probably goes away, you feel a bit more fortified, right? So it's really useful in terms of its kind of physical impact, its physiological impact on the human body if you've got to be at high altitude, if you've got to do any kind of arduous labor. Importantly, that effect goes away quite quickly. It lasts for maybe an hour, 2 hours, right? But it really does work. If you need an extra kind of boost, the key is to chew it with an alkali substance, and that increases the chemical effect on the body, right? So it's got this adaptive role, right? So there's a reason why people in this part of the world have found coca leaves important, right? They just have an adaptive function that makes it a little bit easier to do hard work, to be at high altitudes, to walk long distances in Andean South America. But what's really important, again, what brings us back to why these bags are kind of interesting to me, is the fact that coca is more than that adaptive function, right? Coca leaves have incredible social functions in this part of the world. And as I'll talk about, that seems to endure as well, right? That's a long-standing set of traditions. So one way to think about the sort of social functions of these leaves, right, that people chew because they have an adaptive function, right, because they make you feel better, is to think about the ways in which you might offer coca leaves or offer coca leaves to a friend or an acquaintance, right? It becomes a way of demonstrating friendship or demonstrating a relationship, demonstrating community. Chewing coca can be important in significant family events or community events, right? So a family collectively chewing coca leaves together during, say, an engagement or during a community event, right? For example, the appointment of the new mayor in a town, right? So chewing leaves in that instance also. There has been quite a lot of ethnography written about the ways in which coca leaves are a part of kind of social life in Andean South America. And if this is something that you want to read more about, I could not recommend too highly this ethnography by Catherine Allen from the 1980s called The Whole Life Has. And the image on this slide is from her book, in which she really kind of thinks about the ways in which this leaf acts as this kind of social kind of glue between people. But that's got impacts for our bags as well, right? Because in the same way that a lot of our kind of social activities, right, be it offering somebody alcohol, right, or engaging with people in other kinds of ways, in the same ways those are activities that we have to learn, right, and be sort of initiated in. Chewing coca leaves is also an activity that you have to learn. You have to learn how to do it correctly. You have to learn how to offer it, how to share it, right? And so chewing coca is an activity that comes with a degree of social maturity. And that has implications for who gets to carry these beautiful bags. The colonial chroniclers that I mentioned earlier tell us that during the Inca period, chuspas were actually handed out, these gorgeous bags were handed out to young men when they came of age. So they would go through an initiation ceremony, they would be officially recognized as adults, and they would be given one of these bags, right? That doesn't seem to be so formalized since the Inca Empire, but some of the weavers who I've worked with in southern Peru have suggested that children get to start wearing chuspas between sort of age 8 and 15 years old. This image was taken in 1968 by a researcher who was very young at the time. She was in her early 20s, called Grace Goodall. And she went and did a series of ethnographic collecting for Natural History in New York. And she took this whole series of slides that remained unscanned until 2012 when we scanned them all. And I love this one. It actually became the cover of the book that accompanied this exhibition. And if you look closely at the little boy who's slightly in the shade, in the shadow on the left, you can just see he's got a chuspa. I would estimate him to be about 10 or so. So chuspas are something that marks social identity, right? They mark your age. They potentially, in some contexts, also mark gender. And this is something that's a bit complex. Some scholars have argued that chuspas are things that only men get to carry, right? No, it's explicitly men's accessories. I think that that's overplayed, to be honest, partly because we find Chuspas with both males and females in pre-Hispanic burials. We find depictions of women carrying them. This is another of Guaman Poma's drawings from 1615, and it's a drawing of an Inca queen. She's called a Coya, a queen, and she's carrying her Chuspa. You can see it there in her left hand. So there does seem to be some difference in this, right? But again, perhaps Chuspas are kind of marking out gender in some contexts, if not others. It's not just important to social relationships between people, but also to relationships with the spiritual world, right, with the divine. Coca is central to many ritual practices in a huge, diverse kind of regions of Andean South America. The image on the left is a curandero, or a shaman in southern Peru, and he's preparing an offering to give to the earth. And you can see on just behind the Coke bottle, ironically actually, he's preparing kind of coca leaves that he's going to offer to Pachamama, offer to Mother Earth. The image on the right comes from much, much further away. It actually comes from northwest Argentina. And that, again, is an offering being made to Mother Earth with a series of kind of objects, there's candy and coins and things, but coca leaves have to be in there. And that has, again, implications for our coca bags. There are specific kinds of chuspas that are restricted, that are signifiers of certain kinds of statuses or roles. This is something called a pacucho bag, and it's just made from llama hide. And those seem to be restricted to religious practitioners. This is another of one of the fun things about doing this project was not just looking at the bags itself, but looking at a lot of the accession records that came with the collections that have been made of these bags over the years. So this comes from the 1950s. And of course, these different roles, right? Coca is adaptive, right? It's making you feel better. Coca as a social kind of substance, and Coca as a ritual substance, and not mutually exclusive. I took this photo back in 2001, and these are miners working in a mine in kind of central southern Bolivia, and thinking about just the challenges of doing any kind of arduous labor at high altitude, let alone deep underground mining, right? This is really difficult work, and coca is especially important in mining contexts in the Andes, just to get you through that labor. And so these gentlemen here, these miners, are chewing coca in part to get through the day, but they're also offering it to El Tío, who is the devil, right? Who is understood to be in charge, who rules over life in the mine, right? Underground life, right? So again, coca is implicated in all of these different ways in the ethnographic record, but we also have a lot of evidence, other kind of additional, I just wanted to mention this briefly, in addition to these kind of ethnographic data, its cultural significance gets reinforced in other sorts of cultural media. So lots of songs and poems will reference coca leaves. This is a very famous Quechua song with a translation into English on the right. It's a song to the coca, right? It's a song saying how wonderful it is, how it's the only thing that understands this individual. So we have all of this evidence of how important coca has been in the ethnographic record and in the present. But we also have a lot of archaeological evidence that this sort of significance, this use, this cultivation, this consumption of the leaf has been going on for thousands and thousands of years in this part of the world. As I mentioned earlier, right, the feathered bag, we actually sometimes find the leaves within the bag. I'll happily talk about it at the end. This presented some challenges legally when we were doing an exhibition of these bags, because as we will talk about, this is now a banned substance in this country. So we sometimes find the leaves themselves. We sometimes find the alkali substance that is used to chew with the leaf. We very occasionally in the Andes, in human mummies, find wads of coca still in the mouths of mummified individuals, right? That's pretty rare. Because coca has the cocaine metabolite in it, we actually sometimes can find evidence of an individual having chewed coca by doing certain kinds of chemical analyses of, say, human hair on a mummy. And that has suggested that humans have been chewing coca in this part of the world since at bare minimum 350 BC. More common than the actual leaf itself, archaeologically, though, are depictions of people chewing it, right? I just showed you the gentleman earlier doing the agricultural work, and he had his lump in his cheek. And that image shows up repeatedly across a huge territory and a huge range of media and a huge range of time zones in Andean South America in the pre-Hispanic archaeological record, right? So a Tiwanaku vessel, this dates to about AD 1100, the ceramic vessel on the left, you can see that lump really clearly. The little Inca silver figurine on the right. And then the one in the middle is actually from Colombia. It's made of wood, and the dates on it aren't very good. It's kind of first millennium AD, roughly. So you've got extensive evidence, right, that this product, the leaf, that our beautiful bags are made to hold, has been important in many spheres of Andean life for thousands and thousands of years, right? But of course, most of us who aren't from the Andes first know about coca because of its connection to cocaine. And so for the last little bit of this talk, I wanted to talk about kind of how coca arrived on the international stage. And then right at the end, begin to think about how that kind of international presentation of the leaf, how we globally have reacted to this leaf, right? This leaf that people have been cultivating and consuming and using in their social and their ritual and their economic lives for thousands of years in Andean South America, how that then kind of impacts the way that we think about those bags, okay? So when the Spanish showed up, and we mentioned Spanish conquest a little bit earlier, when they arrive in the Andes in the 1530s and conquer the Inca Empire in 1533, the Spanish authorities are a little bit perplexed by what to do about the coca leaf, right? They see people chewing it, right? It's clearly a widely produced and consumed product in Andean South America, but the Spanish are a bit conflicted about it. And they're conflicted because a lot of Spaniards, including actually our Guaman Poma de Ayala, right, who drawn these wonderful drawings, a lot of Spaniards really didn't just regard its consumption as strange and uncultured, but they actually thought it was evil, right? They associated consuming coca, chewing coca, with the devil. So what happens at the very beginning of the Spanish rule in the Andes is there's a call to ban it, right? To completely stop people consuming coca at all, right? Indigenous populations consuming it. And in 1552, an ecclesiastical council in Lima banned it outright. They just said, this is just not okay. We associate this with the devil. We need to stamp this practice out and bring God and Catholicism to the Andes. The problem is economics get in the way, because other Spaniards quite quickly realized that they had a commercial interest in coca production. In part because they realized that if the indigenous workers they were putting to really hard work in silver mines chew coca, they might work harder. And they also realized that some of them had been granted lands in the New World that had extensive coca plantations. And then the church itself realized that they also had some of those lands. And so maybe they didn't want to ban its production altogether. So quite early on, actually in 1573, those restrictions on any coca production were completely lifted by Spanish authorities, and coca production basically continued and thrived for the next several centuries, but specifically for a local Andean market, right? So you've got Spaniards saying, let's encourage the production of this stuff. We're not going to consume it ourselves because we don't think it's something that we want to do, right? They look down on it very much as a practice, but they encouraged the production, and a lot of Spaniards made a lot of money off coca production in the colonial period. By the mid-19th century, though, coca leaves are beginning to become a little bit more well-known outside of the Andes. And you have a number of European travelers in Peru and in Bolivia and in Ecuador writing home about this fabulous product that they've just discovered. This is an Italian physician who was just so blown away by coca leaves that he encouraged all of his colleagues to start consuming it and start using it. And this kind of European traveler sort of reports about coca leaves coincides very conveniently with the development of alkaloid sciences, especially in places like Germany. And so you get a lot of young, eager scientists in the middle of the 19th century wanting to work with this product, right? Wanting to work with coca. So Albert Niemann in 1860 identifies the coca plant's active principle. So he identifies cocaine, essentially. In 1884, the ophthalmologist Nicola realized that it had really useful anesthetic properties. So by the mid to late 19th century, you've got a lot of scientists getting really into coca. It's now finding this sort of global market outside of the Andes. So 7,000 years of people in the Andes having all of these important cultural uses for it. Middle to late 19th century, it's starting to explode on the international stage. And that scientific work coincides pretty roughly with a series of very enterprising entrepreneurs, right? The most famous, or the first of them, is this Corsican individual called Angelo Mariani. And in 1863, Angelo Mariani made what he called a coca wine. So he basically took what he at least claimed was Bordeaux wine. It was some kind of red wine. And he mixed it with coca leaves. And he had an immensely successful product on his hands, in part to a very aggressive marketing campaign, which basically presented coca as a therapeutic, right? So he produced this coca wine, and then he produced these extra strong coca wines and coca lozenges, and he got all of these kind of famous people, including, in theory, Pope Leo III, to endorse it, right? And then, of course, as I said, right, we have to touch base in Atlanta if we're going to talk about coca wines, right? Because, of course, in 1886, John Pemberton launches his own version, right? Angelo Mariani did it first. It then happens over here, of course, when he makes his own version, right? So he mixes his wine and the coca leaves, and he calls it Peruvian wine. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this early history of Coca-Cola, but wine gets taken out of the recipe here fairly early on, the cola nut added, and of course we get Coca-Cola. But the US at this point, end of the 19th century, is importing as much as 1,000 metric tons of coca leaves from Peru each year. Peru ramps up its production of coca leaves, its cultivation, to respond to that. By 1906, Coca-Cola has decided to stop putting the actual leaf into their coca wine, but they continue to use the leaf as an important flavoring ingredient in that famous merchandise number 5 that they'll tell you about at World of Coke, right? So Peru ramps up its production. There's a huge global market for the coca leaf, right? It's now this product that's wanted on the global stage, not just in the Andes. But by the early 20th century, there's growing awareness of the dangers of cocaine, right? So all the way back, of course, Neiman's identified the active principle that is cocaine. And by the early 20th century, there's growing awareness that this is a dangerous product, right? That there are potentially dangers to consuming derivatives of the coca leaf. And of course, at that point, we start to see state and federal laws banning it in the US, and that turned to pressure on other nations. In the mid-1940s, Peru, having been, part of this cultural practices that had used the coca leaf for thousands of years, Peru begins to develop domestic prohibition movements on it. Ultimately, this all leads to the 1961 UN Convention on Narcotic Drugs. Peru and Bolivia both signed it in the 1960s, and it included stipulations that they would destroy their coca plants, they would destroy any coca cultivation, and they would completely abolish coca chewing. Of course, once we get into the 1980s and the 1990s, the cocaine epidemic that hit Europe and the US only added weight to this move to ban and wipe out coca production. And that's when we see the massive eradication programs that many of you may remember from the news at this point. That's had a knock-on effect around cultural practice, traditional cultural practices to do with coca leaves in Andean South America. Because as we've seen, people have been using this leaf, producing this leaf for thousands of years. And that has, as some of you who know Latin American politics will be familiar with, that has been used to political effect by some people, right? By some political actors. Most notably Evo Morales, who until about a year ago was the president of Bolivia, and who had, previous to his political career, been a coca leaf grower. And he had been the leader of Coca Growers Union, and ultimately became president. And during his tenure, he said Bolivia just cannot accede to this UN convention anymore, and removed Bolivia from it. They did reaccede in 2013, but without the stipulation to ban the leaves. Again, any of you who follow Latin American politics will know that Bolivia has been through some turmoil over the past year or so, with Morales having been pushed out, but his ex-party is now back in control. So it's unclear quite how Bolivia's relationship around coca will continue. But that being said, coca leaves continue to be grown And both they and derivative products are sold quite openly and legally within Andean nations. But I want to come back to this packaging, right? Because what you're seeing on the left is coca leaves in a new version of these bags, right? In these small disposable plastic bags, right? Which brings me back to what happens to these gorgeous textiles that we started out with, right? And so I just want to briefly talk about Chuspas today, because I think that there is this really interesting situation in which the very product that defined these bags for thousands and thousands of years is now really condemned and derided on a global stage, and with good reason, right? None of us want to see a mass black market in cocaine, but it has an impact for then how we think about these bags, right? Because what made them unique, what made them distinct, was the fact that they held these coca leaves and that they were embedded in all of these social and ritual practices that Andean peoples have been doing for millennia, right? Because at the same time, these textiles are getting lauded and consumed, right, by international audiences. So be it in the context of exhibitions, including the one that we did on these bags, or be it as expressions of heritage. This is a Bolivian American heritage parade from 2012 in New Jersey. And if you look closely at the young men and women, you can see that several of them have these little chuspas hanging from their belts, right? They still are kind of used as signifiers of Andean heritage or of Andean identity in many contexts. They're also really convenient souvenirs these days. This is a tourist market in southern Peru. The bag on the left, was bought from that market, right? And they are sold as chuspas, right? That is the word that is used. I could speak at length about the imagery in that bag on the left, but it's basically a mishmash of Andean imagery. It doesn't make any coherent sense as a piece of art, but it signifies Andeanness, right? It's recognizable to a tourist that's what it signifies. You can also buy them on the internet. The ones on the right are ones that we bought for the exhibition that are literally sold as chuspas. That's again what they are called if you Google search them. They've got little llamas on the buttons, right? Again, they are being marketed as this particular product, right? So I think that these bags are sort of getting transformed, and that's kind of the point I wanted to make with this throughout is, these are not just pieces of art, right? They're not just these kind of neutral objects, but they have for thousands and thousands of years been embedded in these much wider social contexts, political contexts, economic contexts. I just want to finish with one last point because I still don't know quite what to think about this. As I said, all of this research was done originally for an exhibition. The exhibition was on display in 2014 in New York City. And it got, as exhibitions do, some press, right? But what really struck me at the time was one of the places that decided to write about this exhibition. And that's this magazine called Accessories. And Accessories is a trade publication for the accessory part of the fashion industry. And bizarrely, they decided that they were going to write about this exhibition, right? And they assured their readership, right? It's the voice of the women's accessories industry, apparently, right? They assured their readership that one of the most iconic looks of 2014 were chuspas, right? Were these little hand-woven bags. So I still don't know quite what to think about this last little bit, but to me, it just kind of reinforced the idea that, when we look at artifacts, when we look at objects that we work with as archaeologists or as ethnographers, they have these much bigger stories that they can tell us, right, as anthropologists. And to me, these chuspas are particularly emblematic of that. So again, there are a bazillion people who were involved in this project, partly because it was an exhibition project. So lots of people who I wouldn't normally get to work with. So I may be forgetting people, but I think that was all I had for you, Bill.
Thank you. That was phenomenal. I really appreciate that. I know a lot of our participants, I was watching what their reactions were, and they were engaged really well. We actually have 3 questions that were submitted. I'm going to start with a question that was submitted to me privately, so
Okay.
Not everybody can see it. Someone asked, are chuspas worn all the time?
No, I think that's a really important question, right? And I think it depends on when we're talking about. Certainly today, so the ethnographic work that I did, let me just The ethnographic work that I did in Peru was mostly in 2 regions, and neither in the examples I showed you were from southern Peru. And that's a part of the Andes, which I actually think are really interesting in terms of how people are using quote unquote traditional dress, right? Mm-hmm. It's a part of the Andes where a lot of women will still wear kind of what we would maybe use the word traditional dress, right? On a day-to-day basis, certainly when they're in their home villages. The men less so. But any kind of important sort of ritual event or community event, then you would see those chuspas come out. To the extent, and actually this was a really interesting kind of component of that, was talking to these weavers. There's this whole rental market now in chuspas because people aren't wearing them on a day-to-day basis. It's like you can rent one for like that special fiesta you've got to go to that weekend, right? Rather than buying your own. So I think it's actually a really interesting question. Certainly, I think, you know, if we were to go back a little bit earlier, yeah, you would be wearing one every day because you want to have your Coca with you every day. But I think it's, again, emblematic of the ways in which these bags are used is so tied up in broader kind of social context. Yeah.
Thank you. Tony Z has a question. He says, does chewing coca leaves affect the teeth?
That's a really good question, actually, and I wish my colleague Bethany Turner was here, because my understanding is there is actually some debate over the impact it has on your teeth. Like, certainly if you chew it, you can see somebody's been chewing a leaf, right? Mm-hmm. It's kind of like if you chew spinach, you know, you can see it right then. I think that there is still some debate over whether it has any kind of long-term, you know, if there are any sort of dental cavities that you can pick up on it. I would have to look that up, because I think that there is still some debate amongst the dental folks about that. Okay. It's a good question though, yeah.
Sure. Manny has a question. Were coca leaves ever concentrated and used before the active ingredient was identified? And were chuspas worn all day long? So we covered that one. So go ahead.
I believe not, actually. I don't think it's my understanding is, you know, and obviously, like, I would never in giving these talks want to say that the cocaine trade is good, right? Like, but my understanding is no, right? It's certainly not, the derived cocaine product is not something that we see until the late 19th century. That's my understanding of it, yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. We have a question from my mother. Mm-hmm. And she's thinking along the same lines I am. I actually have questions that I wrote down, and I can't believe my mom and I came up with similar questions. How did they get the different colors?
Of the textiles?
Yeah, I was thinking about the dyes and what kind of minerals they're using, because I think I saw blue in there. Blues are really tough colors.
They are really tough, yeah. It's most of what I showed you, obviously until we got to the synthetic stuff, is either a mineral base or a plant base, right? You're right, the blue is the really hard one. So even some of the weavers who I've worked with more recently, even the weavers who are often still trying to use kind of natural dyes, right, plant-based dyes, the blue is the one thing, right, that they may be buying commercially, yeah. But until that, and my initial work with textiles was back in 2007 for the Field Museum, when they did an ethnographic collections project, and I was working mostly in 2007 with a cooperative of weavers based out of Cusco, which, if anybody's ever in Cusco, you should go to their cooperative. It's called the Center for Traditional Textiles of Cusco. And it was set up by a weaver whose name is on that last slide, called Nilda Kayanupa. And her idea was to her languages that she uses to revitalize textile production by returning to things like natural dyes and natural fibers and so forth. And she's actually been immensely successful in doing that and in creating a very successful kind of market for selling these products to tourists. They're incredible. If anybody's ever in Cusco, they should go. But that was one of the places where they've been trying to figure out like exactly what recipes of plants and minerals produce particular greens or particular reds or so forth. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And really quick follow-on comment. If you're looking for somebody to do kind of pigment analysis, a colleague of mine, Hillary Becker, she's a big pigment person.
Okay, that would be great.
Yeah, I've worked with her in Italy, and she's very, very good.
Oh, that would be great. I've seen some people try to do it with some northern Chileans. We've never done it with any of the textiles. Most of the textiles that come out of my project because it's the Dark Ages in Peru. Like, there's not even any dye. They've just given up at that point, to be honest. Like, but I know the Chilean stuff has tried to do it. That'd be really interesting to see. Yeah, to talk with her.
Excellent. John Mays has a question. Are the descendants of Incas still carrying coca leaves and chuspas?
That's a good question. So if you buy coca leaves, as you can, right? I mean, it's perfectly legal to buy it within Peru per national law, right? You will buy it in the way that you saw in that image of the lady selling it in the plastic bags, those little green plastic bags. That's how you buy it, right? But as I mentioned earlier, many people do still own, or sometimes, as I said, rent those chuspas. But on a day-to-day basis, I normally see people carrying the plastic bag. But certainly, yeah, people are chewing it on a routine basis. Archaeology is hard physical labor. A lot of people chew coca leaves, Peruvian and non-Peruvian, when they're doing archaeology, because it does what it says on the tin, right? It really does work. I don't really like the taste of it, but it does what you want it to do, right? It makes you feel a bit better. Mm-hmm.
Sure. Manny has another question. Were coca leaves chewed all day long?
I think that's really hard to know, especially with the past. It actually starts to numb your mouth if you chew it for too long, right? Like I don't think you would want to chew it all day long. But I would imagine if you're in that mine for 14 hours. Yeah. The other thing it does that I didn't mention is it suppresses hunger. So it's another, there's another kind of like physiological benefit to chewing it if you have to be down a mine or walking long distance. It's amazing like what that leaf does to the human body for a short period.
Mm-hmm. Ken Akins asks, were there any other items carried in a chuspa, personal items, other food?
That's a really good question. And I do totally normally get the fair question, which is like, how do you know it's a chuspa, right? And honestly, certainly I like to think of these objects in the way that I think many of us think about objects, right? Like they don't often have just one sole purpose. There are other kinds of bags in Andean textile repertoires that have different names that, are used for carrying like bread and so forth. But most chuspas are pretty small, right? If you saw most of the examples I gave you, they're not actually very big. You can't actually get a whole lot else in there.
Okay. If I mispronounce his name, I really apologize. It's Phaedra, I think.
Oh, Phaedra.
Phaedra. She has two questions. First, are these used for other things? It's a fairly basic design. Are they different from one kind of bag to another? Are they made? Are they different if they're made in the Andes or not? Second, any sense of why the Spaniards vilify coca chewing? Is there any context or random symbolic choice for othering Andeans?
Yeah, Phaedra, that question about like who's chewing it in the early colonial period is actually really interesting. There is an Argentinian historian, I don't have her name in front of me, but I will make sure you get it, who has written a really interesting piece about colonial women, mestizo women, so women of both Andean and European heritage, who wanted to chew coca, were chewing coca, but wouldn't use a chuspa, right? They would use like a regular little purse and put the coca in it, because very early on in the colonial period, coca chewing gets characterized as indigenous, right? As by extension, as lower class, right? As not something you do if you are a cultivated European. And I will find that for you, Phaedra, that article, because it's really, really interesting. This Argentinian historian who, traces the way in which specifically women in the colonial period were like apparently chewing coca, but not wanting to visibly be carrying emblems of chewing coca. But yeah, to this day, I think even in the Andes today, I think coca chewing is still often characterized as not something cultured people do, right? Quote unquote.
Okay, thank you. Carrie asks if there were particular chuspas stylistically for men or for women.
That's a really good question. And, I really did struggle with trying to figure the gender question out, because I think I mentioned like quite a lot of the scholarship just says Chuspas are a man thing, not a woman thing. And I think that that's a problematic assertion. Maybe not all women would have carried them, but we certainly, like I showed you, have the images of the Inca queens carrying what are clearly Chuspas, and they do show up in burials. You know, I never want to assume that what's in a burial necessarily belonged to that individual, but the fact that they show up in male and female burials, perhaps. I think it's probably really regional. So actually, ethnographic, talking about today, the part of Peru where I work as an archaeologist, there women don't carry Chuspas. Men do, but women will carry it's basically like almost like a little handkerchief, woven textile, like again, really elaborately woven piece of textile that they'll fold up into kind of like a little pouch almost, and they will carry coca in that. So I think the gender thing's super variable. Yeah. Thank you.
Leonard asks, do the colors in the fabrics deteriorate with age and or exposure?
Yeah, you know, so especially archaeological textiles, like, you know, as I said many times, we're very lucky, those of us who do archaeology in the Andes, because of the preservation, that we find textiles at all. But certainly a textile that sits out in the sun for an extended period, and the sun's strong at high altitude, right? A textile that sits out in the sun for a long time will certainly fade over time, for sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Mm-hmm. Well, we have another question and we have some comments. I'm just going to go ahead and unmute. I'm allowing everybody to unmute themselves. So I can't unmute you, but you know, everyone has the ability to unmute themselves now. Jeff Glover has a question that it's probably best for him to ask.
Okay, Jeff. Hi, Jeffrey.
I love the hat,
well,
Jeff.
Thank you, Nicola. We're representing in our Andean hats.
Oh, yay! Thank you.
So Shaz was asking the earlier question, but I had a question. What else do you think that Italian doctor was taking to be seeing 77,000 other worlds?
I do not know, but it cracks me up every time I read it. Might be my most favorite thing I've ever read in the course of research.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, we've all had, well, not we all, not everyone, but you know, Shaz, me, you, we've had Coca, and it's like a nice cup of tea.
Yeah.
You know,
we're
it's not,
flying on worlds. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway.
Nicola,
Mm-hmm.
I have to say, I attended a lot of meetings and work parties where everybody chewed coca and talking about whether they chew it all day. I have to say, I don't think I ever saw anybody take it out.
Yeah, but it does kind of I've accidentally swallowed it a few times and got in trouble.
Yeah, but you're just constantly
Keep adding to it. Yeah.
I could never figure out when was appropriate to take it out because I never saw anybody do it.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding, because you're supposed to remove it in a very unobtrusive, you don't just spit it out, right? Yeah, I have certainly accidentally swallowed it a few times and been castigated for having made that faux pas. Yeah. Yeah.
I think Jack has a question. Jack, you can unmute yourself.
Somebody's actually letting me unmute myself. That's interesting. I was just going to say my introduction to coca, there were two. One, I was introduced to a small plant and told that it was called the toothache plant.
Mm-hmm.
If you chewed the leaf, it made your mouth.
Yeah.
Well, not only did it make my mouth numb, but I felt kind of high all the way down.
You did the trick, Jack.
And later in Cusco, we were encouraged to drink the coca tea at the hotel.
Yeah.
With an adjustment to the altitude.
Yeah.
It seems to work because I never had any problems with the altitude.
It really does work. I mean, it does do, there's a reason people have been making it producing it and consuming it for so long. I mean, the tea was, I had a brief image of a tea box in right at the end of that slide. Because we put the tea box in the exhibition because we wanted to talk about exactly what you said there, right? That it's now consumed in a bunch of different ways, right? That there are these commercially produced tea bags and lozenges and so forth. And that tea box had 2 tea bags left in it. And the museum were like, you need to remove those tea bags before we put the box on exhibition because it is technically a banned substance, right? So somewhere, I think those tea bags are in my house somewhere, right? But the box was empty in the exhibition, so we didn't like upset any authorities in the process.
Well, I came home with some of them too and hoped that the inspectors didn't find them. And
they rarely care here. I've heard Australia really cares. I'm not sure why Australia particularly really cares, but.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
No, thanks, Jack. It's always a pleasure to talk to you guys.
I do have another question for you. Are the bags themselves, the volume standardized at all? Is there?
No, they do tend to be pretty small. Again, there are larger bags, right? Jeffrey has a beautiful bag that he brings to work quite often that's bigger than a Chuspa, right? There's more like a satchel kind of a size. But no, they're pretty variable. I don't have a tape measure in front of me, but I would say, you know, like an average maybe 8 by 8 inches, 6 by 6 inches, like pretty small, yeah.
Any other questions?
No, great presentation. Thanks for letting us participate.
Oh, it's always fun to talk to you all.
Yes, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks,
And the presentation was awesome. Thank you.
guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nicola.
Thanks.
Great.
All right. Well, I guess that will wrap it up. If you have other questions, please go ahead and feel free to ask. Otherwise, we hope to see you next month in January, second Wednesday of January. I think it's January 13th.
Yes.
Lucky 13. We have a speaker that we are currently lining up. We'll provide details when we've confirmed them. So thanks a lot for participating, and we look forward to being able to get back out on site at some point.
Eventually, right?
Yeah, exactly. So thank you very much, Dr. Sharrat. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
It was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.